and accessing their financial aid. And the reason we're focusing particularly on the financial aid process of the college matriculation journey is that we see what a huge difference financial aid can make. For high school seniors in general, the data shows that those that complete the FAFSA are 63% more likely to enroll in higher education. So by supporting students in filling out the FAFSA, this is one tangible step you can support them in and actually changing those outcomes for college enrollment. We see that students receiving at least $7,500 in financial aid, well, 49% of those students transferred or graduated, compared to students who only received about $1,000 to $2,500 in financial aid. Only 17% of them transferred or graduated. So when we think about supporting these students, there's a really significant role that you all can play as an adult supporter. We'll of course hit on some of the tangible steps you can take in helping them filling out their financial aid applications. But the language you use matters too, and what you say to a young person probably matters maybe more than you think. I like this quote on here. It says, "No one rises to low expectations." And with our students who are, experiencing homelessness, experiencing being in the foster care system, we really want to set the expectations high, consistently, regardless of their past academic performance. A lot of times these students might be associated with a negative stigma. Sometimes they get labeled as not college material. And what you think and the expectations you set really make a difference. And there's a study, this famous Oak School experiment. And teachers were actually, in this experiment, led to believe that certain students in their classroom were showing signs of spurts in intellectual growth and development. And so at the end of the year, the students of whom the teachers just had these expectations that these students showed greater gains in intellectual growth, they ended up doing better than the students in the control group, just by the teachers thinking that those students were smarter than the others. We've also seen that studies conducted in higher education, that they show similar and equally significant expectancy advantage for those students for whom instructors maintain higher expectations. So we encourage you to maintain these high expectations for these students, that they will go on to college, that they will be successful, that they will graduate from college. You can even think about little shifts in your language. Instead of "if you go to college," you can use phrases such as "when you go to college," or "what are you going to study when you're in college?" So continuing to set these expectations and use this framing with the students as well can make a big difference. So I just want you to keep that in mind as we move through these sections today on some of these key tips for assisting them with the financial aid process. So when we talk about financial aid, we really think about it as a three-step process. The first step is, completing the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid, or the CADA, the California Dream Act application. And, depending on the student, that could take maybe 30 minutes to an hour. But then at the same time, we want you to assist those students who are also in the foster care system with completing the CHAFE application. And we're going to talk today about what that application is and how students can access that funding as well. And then the third step is creating a web grants account. And this is pretty quick process, takes about 10 minutes. And so we're also going to be discussing how a student can create this account today and how to utilize it and how it can support them in managing their financial aid. So step one, what are some key steps to keep in mind when supporting these students and completing the FAFSA? I'm going to give you a bit of a broad overview, but then dive into some special considerations for our foster youth and then for our homeless youth students as well. So as many of you know, there's two applications. A student can either fill out the free application for federal student aid, the FAFSA. This is for students that are U.S. citizens or permanent residents, or other eligible non-citizens. And they can fill that out at fafsa.ed.gov, or they now actually have a mobile app as well that the student can fill out the application on there, go back and forth. They could do it online on their computer, start and stop it on their phone, either way. The other application is the California Dream Act application, the CADA, and the website's listed there. And this is for applicants that are qualified undocumented students, where they'd be eligible to receive state financial aid. So we just wanted to note, for any of you that are working with students in the foster care system that might be undocumented, we want to make sure that you're aware of something called Special Immigration Juvenile Status, SIJS. Essentially, undocumented children, if they're involved in adoption or guardianship proceedings, or they've been the victim of abuse or neglect, they might be able to obtain something called SIJS. And what this application does, it actually allows them to become a lawful permanent resident. But in order to get this status, they have to apply before they turn 18. So particularly if you are a high school counselor working with any high school seniors, if they're in the foster care system and they're undocumented, you want to ask them if they've applied for SIJS. And if not, you want to encourage them to talk to their child welfare agency to get information about this process and see if they're interested in applying. Because again, they can only apply before they turn 18. Now, if you are working with a student that has applied, sometimes it can take a couple years before the application gets processed. So just to note that if they have a pending application for SIJS, they still have to fill out the California Dream Act application until their application for SIJS is processed and they've actually received that permanent resident status, or also known as a green card. That while that application is pending, they still do the California Dream Act application. Now, also to note, and I'm sure many of you know this just in general, about when to apply for the FAFSA or the California Dream Act application. So for students in general, the priority application period is between October 1st and March 2nd. So right now, before the start of the school year that they're going to begin college. So students who are interested in going to college for 2021-22 school year would be applying right now. Now, there are some special exceptions for foster youth attending community college with this deadline, and I'll share more about that in the next slide. But just so you know, in general for students, this is the general priority application. Students can apply after this deadline. They just might receive less financial aid. So it's really important that we have them apply before March 2nd to get, all the financial aid possible. And they don't need to know yet, which college they're going to attend. They can fill out these applications before they even apply to college. They just indicate which colleges they're thinking of applying to. Now, some colleges may have earlier priority deadlines, particularly maybe private schools or maybe some out of state. So it's important that they do check with those colleges for any additional priority deadlines as well. So as I mentioned, the general application period, priority application period for the FAFSA or the California Dream Act is, October 1st to March 2nd. However, there were recently some exciting changes to the Cal Grant that apply for foster youth. Now, there's many different types of Cal Grant. We're not going to go into all of those today. Cal Grant A, Cal Grant B. But Cal Grant B there's an entitlement grant. These are for low-income students that have at least a 2.0 GPA. It can assist with, cost of tuition at 2-year and 4-year schools, at 4-year universities, helps with the cost of living. In general, for those students, they have to apply by March 2nd. However, there was some changes with this Cal Grant B entitlement specifically for foster youth. So now those foster youth, if they're planning on attending community college, they actually have up until September 2nd to apply, and then they'd still be eligible for the Cal Grant B. In addition, for students in general, they have to apply within 1 year of high school graduation. But for foster youth, they can actually apply anytime up to the age of 26. So maybe they graduated from high school, they take a year or two off, then they decide to go back to college. That's great. They can apply and they can still get the Cal Grant B entitlement. In addition, students in general can only receive the Cal Grant B for up to 4 years. However, our foster youth are actually able to receive the Cal Grant B for up to 8 years. So this really gives them the flexibility to have this significant financial aid, while attending a California university or college for up to 8 years. All right. So completing the FAFSA, let's start off with a few special considerations for those of you working with foster youth students. Now, we're not going to go through the whole application today. There's a lot of questions in the FAFSA. We're really just going to hit on a few key points to keep in mind for your foster youth students. So I think for youth in the foster care system, the most important section here is this dependency status section. And just as a refresher, this section verifies for the purposes of the FAFSA if the student is considered dependent or independent. If they're considered independent on the FAFSA, that means that they do not need to report their parents' demographics or parent financials. Essentially, the FAFSA is based only on their own information and their own financial information. So there's a series of questions in this section that determines if a student might be independent on the FAFSA. They ask these questions in order. As long as they meet one of the criteria, they meet the qualifications for independent status. It starts off with questions about their age. They can become independent if they're over a certain age, if they're married, if they have children. In addition, there's these questions as well. And you'll see on here that there are 2 questions that pertain specifically to youth in the foster care system, which may also deem them as independent status. So one of the questions here says, at any time since you turned age 13, were both your parents deceased? Were you in foster care, or were you a dependent or ward of the court? If the student can answer yes to this question, that they would qualify as independent on the FAFSA. The other question on here says, does someone other than your parent or step-parent have legal guardianship of you as determined by a court in your state of legal residence? So if you're also working with a student who is in legal guardianship, they can also qualify for independent status. So let's go back to the one that asked if they were ever in care after the age of 13. This one can be a little confusing for students sometimes. So just to give a little bit more information, it's only asking them if they were basically in out-of-home care, removed from their parents for at least 1 day after the age of 13. So hypothetically, a student could be dependent or ward of the court from the age of 13 to 14. They're then adopted, or they're then reunified with their parents. They still would qualify as independent on the FAFSA as long as they were a dependent or ward of the court for at least 1 day after the age of 13. Now, families can get involved in the child welfare system. They might even be involved with the courts. Just because they're involved in the child welfare system or having to go to court doesn't necessarily mean that they're a dependent or ward of the court. These are students who are actually removed from the home in what's called out-of-home care and under the jurisdiction of the court. So just to clarify that as well, because that can be a little confusing for students. Some students might also be involved in the foster care system and also involved in the probation system. And so they might be under the jurisdiction of probation. That can happen as well. So just want to note that. And some students might be in what's called family maintenance. Family maintenance, again, is one of those scenarios where they're involved in the child welfare system, the courts are involved, but they remain with the home of parent. So those students would not qualify for independent status unless they were in out-of-home care for at least 1 day after the age of 13. So these are really important questions. A lot of times students might, like I said, be reunified with their family. Maybe they're with a foster parent or a resource parent. Those students do not have to report any foster parent information, any resource parent information on the FAFSA. They are considered independent for the purposes of the FAFSA. So how is it verified? Let's say you're working with a student, they were a dependent or ward of the court. What might happen is the school that they plan on attending might actually follow up with the student and ask for verification. So there's a new process in place where now this verification is automated through a data match with the California Department of Social Services. So if that box is checked, the college or university is able to verify on their end in their system and look up in CDSS to see if they actually were in the foster care system. I will note that even though this is the law, it's not happening across the board. And so you might still have students who have to get flagged to provide verification. And what that's going to look like is the college or university is going to ask them to provide what's called a word of the court letter. And so if they need to get that word of the court letter, we have instructions here on the slide of how the student can get it. If they're a current foster youth, they would either contact their county social worker or their independent living program, ILP. And either of those two folks would be able to assist the student in getting the word of the court letter. If they're former foster youth, they would actually just be able to contact the state foster care ombudsman's office, and the number is listed on the slide, and they'd be able to assist the student as well in getting this word of the court letter. So, ideally, it'll be automated. The student won't have to provide verification, but just, to prepare you and the student that they might get flagged for verification by the college. So there's other considerations as well for foster youth to think about when filling out the FAFSA. In the FAFSA, students have to report their financial information, any income that they earned or received from the prior year, even if they're an independent student. And just to note, many foster youth choose to enter what's called extended foster care, where they opt into foster care between the ages of 18 to 21. And by participating in the extended foster care program, they might receive a monthly check or benefits, commonly known as SILT payments. And if they are receiving these monthly payments, the student does not have to report this info on their FAFSA. So even if the payments are sent directly to the youth, in their name, they do not need to put this information on the financial section of their FAFSA. Another thing to note too is if they're receiving any supplemental security income, SSI, they also don't need to report this on the FAFSA as well. Another consideration as well with the FAFSA is in an earlier section, there is a question that asks, are you a foster youth or were you at any time in the foster care system? And so this question, it doesn't automatically enroll them into any programs or resources, but we do encourage students to check off the box and say yes. Even if they were in foster care for just one day, there's a lot of great resources and programs at our colleges and universities specifically for foster youth. And a lot of times these programs, they find out who their students are by this box, by students self-identifying, and they'll reach out to them and tell them about their resources. So we just encourage them to check off this box if they were in foster care, because they might be able to get connected to additional resources or support. Another thing to keep in mind, and this is actually a common barrier that we see for a lot of our students in the foster care system, is for many of our foster youth, particularly our high school seniors, when they get to the financial section, they're going to be asked if they filed taxes for the prior year. And most of our high school seniors, they didn't make enough money to have to file taxes, or maybe they didn't make any money at all. And so they're usually going to check the box that says, I'm not going to file taxes. Now, for a lot of those students, they might get flagged by their college or university to provide what's called verification from the IRS of non-filing. So unfortunately, they'll have to generally fill out a form saying, yes, I verify that I really didn't file taxes. Now, under normal times, this form can be really cumbersome and challenging for students to have to fill out. But I just want to make sure that you all know there was some recent guidance that came out from the federal government, particularly due to COVID, that said, getting this form is difficult, and particularly for foster youth. It says in the guidance that they are able to just self-certify and sign a statement, an affidavit saying that, you know, I didn't make any money, or I didn't make enough money to have to file taxes, and then that will suffice. So I just want to make sure you know for your foster youth students that they currently don't have to get this form. If they do get flagged, to provide it. We listed on our website here, there's the link jbay.org/IRS-BNF, and we listed some information about this recent guidance. So this can be confusing for students. So if you have any students that are getting flagged, to provide the verification, just check out this guidance to remind them of their rights, you know, so they don't have to provide that at this time. There's other information in there as well for students in general. You know, students in general are also experiencing challenges with this form under COVID, and there is information in the guidance that they can also self-certify. However, they'll also need to provide information like W-2s or other documents where foster youth don't have to do that. So I would encourage you to check out that link for more information as well. So those were a few kind of key tips to keep in mind with the FAFSA when working with foster youth, right? We've got the dependency section. We want to make sure they're self-identifying, saying that they're a foster youth, and that they know their rights around the IRS non-filing verification form. So now we're going to hit on some key steps around students who are experiencing homelessness when it comes to filling out the FAFSA. Now, before we go into this, I want to note one thing. As I mentioned before, with the dependency status section, there's many ways that a student can qualify for independent status, and they only have to check one. So you might have a student that's in the foster care system and also experiencing homelessness. I would recommend, as you'll see as we go through this section on the homelessness area, that it's a little more complicated to self-certify and verify homelessness for the purposes of the FAFSA. So if you have a student that's both a current or former foster youth and homeless, I'd actually encourage them to just check off the box that they were in the foster care system, because that might be a little bit of an easier process to self-certify than homelessness. But let's dive in. How do we qualify for independent status if you're a student experiencing homelessness? So you'll see here the application asks, as I showed you before, you know, a series of questions, one of them being about foster care, but there's also this question where they can also qualify for independent status, and it says, on or after July 1st, 2020, were you homeless or were you self-supporting and at risk of being homeless? Now, of course, the year and the date for this question changes each year. This screenshot is for students who are applying now for the 2021-2022 academic school year. So the student will indicate yes or no to this question. So let's talk a little bit more about what this means. What does it mean to be homeless or self-supporting or at risk of homelessness? All right. So the definition of homelessness, it's a little complicated. One, the student must be unaccompanied. This means not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian. So if the student is homeless, but with a parent or guardian, then they don't meet the criteria of homelessness for the FAFSA to qualify for independent status. If they are unaccompanied, they must also be either homeless or what's called self-supporting and at risk of being homeless. So the definition of homelessness, it's essentially lacking a fixed, regular, and adequate housing. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what this means on the next slide. The other option, if they don't meet the criteria for homeless, is that they have to be self-supporting. This means when a student pays for his or her own living expenses, including their housing, and that they're at risk of being homeless. So there's a possibility that the student's housing may cease to be fixed, regular, and adequate. This could be someone that's, you know, about to be evicted from their home. Now, just to note, a student living in any of these situations that's fleeing an abusive parent may be considered homeless, even if the parent would provide support and a place to live. to the student otherwise. So let's talk a little bit more about that definition of homelessness. The FAFSA follows the McKinney-Vento definition of homelessness. So what does that really mean to have a lack of fixed, regular, and adequate housing? Well, there's actually several different types of living situations that are specified in the law that meet this criteria. The first is sharing housing with other persons due to a loss of housing, economic hardship, or any other similar reason. Essentially this means couch surfing. Now, this is really particularly important to understand because there's other types of definitions for homelessness used by the federal government, such as HUD, and they actually don't consider couch surfing as homeless. So it's important to know that for this definition, couch surfing does count. So if you are working with a student who is couch surfing and bouncing around from house to house, they would be considered homeless for the purposes of independent status on the FAFSA. There's also more traditional situations that would qualify, such as living in motels, hotels, trailer parks, or camping grounds due to a lack of alternative adequate accommodations. Or you could be living in an emergency or transitional shelter, or having a primary residence that is a place not designed for ordinary use, such as regular sleeping accommodations. This could be a student that's sleeping in their car, public spaces, abandoned buildings, substandard housing, bus or train stations, or similar settings. So once the student determines they do not meet the criteria and they check the box, it then asks the student a series of additional questions. It asks whether the student can or has received a determination from one of 3 specific entities to verify their status. The first option is their McKinney-Vento liaison at their high school or school district. They can provide verification. The second would be a director of an emergency shelter or transitional housing program that receives funding from HUD. That's the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And the third would be a director of a runaway or homeless youth basic needs center or transitional living program. Now, this is actually referring to a very specific program that receives funding from the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. Truthfully, there aren't a lot of these programs in California, but they do exist. Most students who do receive verification, they typically receive it from their homeless youth liaison, but they can certainly receive it from any of these other entities as well. So let's say you've got a student, they're able to receive verification from one of these 3 entities. They would check the appropriate box, and then we'll show you what to do on the next slide. So they just click next. And then they'll have to provide verification from that entity. So what we have included here is a link to Schoolhouse Connection, a great organization, and they have a wonderful template that someone can use who meets one of the criteria listed in the prior slide. So again, this could be, getting that verification letter from that homeless youth liaison or director of an emergency shelter or transitional shelter. They can fill out this form and submit it to the financial aid administrator. Now, one thing to note is the letter essentially, it just verifies yes or no. Does the student meet the definition? Yes or no, and then giving a signature. The person does not need to provide any information about the circumstances of their homelessness, where are they living, how do they become homeless, none of that, just do they meet the criteria, yes or no, signature. If one of those 3 entities provides the letter, then essentially the financial aid office, they don't need to know anything else. They don't need to know any more information, just what's in the letter. Now, they check off the box. This slide's going to come up next on the FAFSA. It's basically going to say, okay, you're considered independent. They're going to be asked if they want to answer any questions about their parents. They can select no, they can skip these questions and it won't affect their financial aid at all. So now I'm going to talk about a scenario in which a student cannot get a verification letter from one of those three entities. In this scenario, they would still be able to get independent status as homeless, but they would just select none of the above. And then they click next, and then this slide pops up. So they'll receive this notification on the FAFSA if they select none of the above are able to, receive that documentation. It says here that they indicated on their FAFSA that they were homeless and that they need to reach out to their financial aid administrator to determine if they meet the criteria for homelessness. Here it provides a little information about what it means to be homeless, what it means to be unaccompanied, just to really make sure that the student understands and that they're clear that they really do meet the definition for the purposes of the FAFSA. If they do, they click next, and then this slide comes up. So here's basically another warning. It lets the students know that they can continue with the application and that they do not need to add information about their parents. However, the expected family contribution, this is what needs to get calculated in order to determine how much financial aid they qualify for, that it will not get calculated until the student follows up with a financial aid administrator at their college in order to get their homelessness status verified. Basically, the FAFSA just wants to make sure that the student knows that there are additional steps necessary in order for their financial aid to get processed. So then they click next, and then this slide comes up. So then it asks them once again, it just wants to double, triple check that the student believes that they really are unaccompanied and either homeless or at risk of being homeless, and that they will indeed not provide information about their parents. If they think that's correct, they check off that box. But then if the student realizes at this point that they don't meet the definition, then they would select, I will provide information about my parents. And then they would have to fill out the sections about parent demographics and financials. And then they would not be considered an independent student. So essentially, if they do meet the criteria, then they select that they're unaccompanied and homeless, and then click next. So at this point, they would need to follow up with their financial aid administrator at their college and receive verification as a homeless student. Now, the truth is financial aid administrators, they actually have a lot of flexibility on how they conduct this verification. The financial aid administrator, they can get assistance with making this determination by contacting a whole range of people. They can reach out to a housing program, a college access program if they're enrolled in one, a medical provider, a therapist, a social worker. They have a lot of discretion to reach out to a range of professionals who might be supporting that student in order to get the necessary verification to meet the definition of homelessness for the FAFSA. Now, if there is no written documentation, which truthfully is often the case, let's say it's a student that's living in their car. Maybe they're embarrassed or ashamed about their homelessness situation. They may not be connected to a professional assisting them around their homelessness. And so there's no written documentation available. So in this case, the financial aid administrator may make a determination based on a documented interview with the student. Now, this is really important to know because it sometimes requires advocacy to ensure that the financial aid administrator understands that they do not need written documentation. They can just ask the student questions about where they are living and document that to verify their homelessness status. It's also important to note that financial aid administrators are actually instructed in the guidance that they receive to not ask personal questions about the circumstances that led to the student's homelessness. So they're only verifying that where the student is living or sleeping meets the definition of homelessness, such as lacking fixed, regular, adequate housing. So if the student says, I've been sleeping in my car for the past 3 months. The financial aid administrator does not need to ask any further questions like, how did you end up in your car, or anything like that. Now, as I mentioned before, if a student receives a determination from a local liaison or Runaway Homeless Youth Act funded program or HUD funded shelter, the financial aid administrator must accept this determination. Unless they actually have direct information to the contrary, they should not be asking the student any additional questions about their housing circumstance. The guidance also states that a student living in the school dormitory may still be considered an unaccompanied homeless youth if the student would be homeless otherwise. And just to know as well that a new determination must be made each year for the FAFSA in order for the student to maintain independent status as a homeless student. So, of course, they might qualify for independent status through other means, such as their age or marital status or being a current or former foster youth. But to qualify as a homeless student, they must verify this every year. So those were some of our kind of quick tips on filling out the FAFSA and special considerations for working with foster youth and homeless youth. I'm now going to turn it over to Yvonne to talk to you about the Chafee grant application and web grants.
Great, thank you so much, Jessica. And I just wanted to mention to all of you out there that while we talk a lot about the FAFSA, just a reminder that the DREAM Act application mirrors the FAFSA. So obviously all of these same rules apply to the DREAM Act application. So a student will fill out the same questions around homelessness or foster youth on either of those two applications. Just wanted to point that out. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So for students that are hoping to be considered for the Chafee grant, which is a separate grant from the Cal grant, from the Pell grant, right? That involves a Chafee application, which I'll show you the website to you so students can access that Chafee grant application. But since the title of the session is maximizing student aid for the student population, we naturally want students to apply for any and all types of aid that they potentially are eligible for. So the Chafee grant is for our foster students, but you'll notice on this last box here that the foster students for the Chafee grant had to have been in an out-of-home foster care placement and a ward of the court for at least 1 day between 16 and 18 years of age. And I wanted to make that distinction because for the FAFSA and the DREAM Act application, when it's asking the federal definition of foster youth, that's looking at age 13 and up. The Chafee grant is specific to students who were in the foster care system between 16 and 18 years of age. So the Chafee grant for a student with the maximum unmet need will receive the maximum Chafee grant award of up to $5,000 for the academic year and can continue to renew that Chafee grant application for 5 years, whether those are consecutive years or not. So a student could potentially attend school 1 year with the Chafee grant, take a gap year or take a break from school, and then resume and potentially receive Chafee funds again for a future year. So whether or not those 5 years are consecutive, a student can receive this award for up to 5 years. And like I said, can renew that award through age 26. There are several things that make the Chafee grant very, very unique as compared with other types of aid. This second box is one of them. This is a California grant that can be used outside of California, and that's because it's also partially federally funded. So it's not restricted to just being used in California. Now, a student who's attending school out of state and wants to use those funds will let the commission know so that we can double check and make sure that that college or university meets certain criteria. It would be the same Cal grant criteria. So if a student, or excuse me, if an institution is eligible, meaning that they're a participant in a Title IV federal Pell Grant program, they have a cohort loan default rate less than 15.5%, and an overall graduation rate greater than 30%. Those are the criteria that an out-of-state school would need to fulfill in order to administer the Chafee grant, but it's possible. And then this is another thing that makes this a unique program. Notice here that the Chafee grant is not capped at the bachelor degree like the Cal grant, like the Pell grant. It's not just for undergrad studies. It can be used towards career technical education, more commonly called VOTech type programs that result in, say, a certificate. And that certificate could be from as short as 4 months up to 2 years. But the Chafee grant's also going to be used for more of the traditional degrees like associate's degrees, bachelor's degrees. But once again, it's not capped at an undergraduate program, which means that students can still use that grant to attend grad school, teacher credentialing programs. So very, very unique aspects of this grant. Next slide, please. So additional things that make this grant unique is that not only can it be used towards tuition fees and books and supplies like most financial aid, it can actually be used and applied towards housing, rent, transportation, childcare, pretty much anything that's going to enable a student to be successful and have those basic needs met. Further emphasizing that there are very, very distinct differences between the Chafee grant and other types of aid are the things that are not required of students. Like this, the students don't have to meet that March 2nd Cal Grant deadline. They don't have to have a social security number, which is why our DREAM Act applicants are also eligible for the Chafee grant. They don't even have to graduate from high school or provide a GPA, nor do they have to register for selective service. So lots of things that are, again, very different about the Chafee grant as compared with other types of aid. Now, I will mention that if students are hoping to get other types of aids besides just the Chafee grant, in other words, they want to apply for a Cal grant or a Pell grant if they're a FAFSA filer, then of course, naturally, they're going to have to meet those particular deadlines and requirements of the other types of aid. Next slide, please. So a student's going to apply online at the Chafee website, which is right here, chafee.csac.ca.gov. And although they don't have to apply by that March 2nd deadline, they do want to apply as soon as possible because they may very well be waitlisted for a grant the very first year that they apply. And this would just be because the way the Chafee grant is paid and awarded to students depends on a hierarchy based on a student's age. So the older students that would potentially age out of this program by age 26 are going to get paid first. So we do want students to apply as soon as possible so that if they are waitlisted that first year, the second year they're ready to go and they have the aid in pocket. Now, when students do submit their Chafee application, it's going to ask which school they're going to attend. And they may not yet know which school they're actually going to be admitted to, but they should put the school that they are hoping to be admitted to or that they likely think that they'll attend, because they can always change it later. And I'll show you how a student's going to change their college of attendance if they need to do that. And the way they're actually going to do that is right here. They're going to set up a portal, and that portal will let them look at all types of state aid that they're receiving, whether it's a Chafee grant, a Cal grant, or a middle class scholarship. So you can see here that this is the very first tab on this landing page at the Chafee website has the Chafee grant application. But what happens for students whose foster youth verification was not automatically confirmed? Remember, Jessica talked earlier about the CDSS, or the California Department of Social Services data match, which identifies students as foster youth. Well, if a student's demographic data has changed since perhaps leaving the foster care system, if their name's changed, if their social security number or date of birth are changed, or they were reported incorrectly on the Chafee grant application, that foster youth status may not be automatically verified. So your students may be prompted to then submit a manual verification form of their foster youth status. And this is where a student would find that. They just tab to the next tab under Chafee eligibility, and the Chafee eligibility form is right there, as are contacts. So if a student doesn't know who their ILP coordinator is or was, or who their probation officer is or was, they have those contacts right here. So be sure to advise your students, if they're prompted on their Web Grants for Students portal to submit a manual verification form, this is where they're going to find that. Next slide, please. So we talked about creating that student portal, right? And this is what this looks like. So students are going to log into or navigate to migrantinfo.csac.ca.gov, and then they'll be prompted to either create an account if they've never done this, or to log in if they have. Now, what's important on here is that the student has to wait a couple of weeks after submitting that FAFSA or DREAM Act application for it to arrive into this system, and then therefore be able to set up that student portal successfully. If they have any struggles or challenges, here's the student contact information for you. And again, you should have a PDF downloadable through the SCED app, and therefore you can print this information and provide that to your students. Next slide, please. So this is the basic flow chart of what students can do on that student portal. They're going to be able to check the award status. They'll be able to determine whether or not they've been awarded, and if not, why, for either the Cal Grant, the Chafee Grant, or the Middle Class Scholarship. But here's what's really helpful is that now, and by the way, I'll mention that this is a very new facelift that the Web Grants for Students portal has received. So it's much more user-friendly, much more informative. So a student's going to be able to log in there and see what the status of their grant is or their award is. And if it shows that it's pending, they can click on that and determine what needs to be done, what actions need to be taken. And I'll show you a couple screenshots of that as well. This is also where students are going to double check to make sure that the college that they reported on the Chafee Grant application is indeed the college that they're going to attend. And if not, they can change it. And if they're receiving a Cal Grant, the Cal Grant requires a GPA with that, right? The Chafee Grant doesn't, but the Cal Grant does. And so this is where a student can click onto the Cal Grant section of that portal and confirm that their GPA was received. So ideally, they're going to want to check that well in advance of that March 2nd deadline. And the reason is because while the high schools are the ones submitting GPAs for our students, sometimes high schools miss the mark. And so a student should be their own advocate and should make sure that all the ducks are in a row, that they themselves have submitted the application, and that their schools have submitted an on-time GPA. So this is where you'll be able to see that. And I will also show you a screenshot on that. And then also for students receiving a Cal Grant, they have to, quote, claim that Cal Grant award. And the claiming process is a two-step process. One, they're confirming the college of attendance. And two, they actually have to self-certify that they did indeed graduate from high school. And so they're going to do all of these functions on that student portal. And then finally, the Chafee Grant, that's where the students can confirm that their foster youth status was indeed received by and verified by the Department of Social Services. Next slide. So a student might log in and see the screen. They're looking at their Chafee Grant application status, and it says right on the screen, and it's a colored tile, it's turned to orange, and it tells that student that the application status is incomplete. So when a student clicks on that to open up the details, next slide please, or next click, they're going to see exactly why it's reflecting as incomplete. We can see here that while they did submit a Chafee application, because the status says it's complete, these two pieces are missing. That student didn't submit a FAFSA or a DREAM Act application, and they also have not been self-certified, or excuse me, automatically certified as foster youth. So that's the prompt I was talking about earlier, when I said a student may be prompted to submit a manual foster youth verification form. And I showed you the website where the students can obtain that form as well. Next click, please. So once a student fulfills all those requirements, they're going to see complete, complete, complete. And at this point, that student is fully eligible for the Chafee grant. But they may still be waitlisted, right? Remember I talked about how a student who may be younger than other students in that pool may have to wait for one academic year before they actually see that they're awarded. So they're going to be in a sort of a pending status, which means that they're fully eligible. They've just not yet been picked up and awarded. But even if a student has all of those items in, it also doesn't necessarily guarantee them award. This particular student was actually awarded preliminarily, meaning our system picked them up. They were high enough on the hierarchy to have been picked up and awarded. But this tells us, if the student clicks on the reason code, that the school went in and took some action, and they said that this student is not eligible because they're not enrolled. Or maybe that student was enrolled less than half time. Either way, this is to emphasize that students should really come to the student portal first before they talk to their high school counselors, before they call the commission, and figure out, if they can, what has transpired on their record. And they can find a lot of information here just by logging into the portals. Certainly, if they can't figure out the reason for their delay in being awarded, encourage them to call the commission, and we can certainly help further. Next slide, please. So this is what the the Cal Grant screen looks like. So this particular student went to the Cal Grant, and they see that their award status is pending. Why is that? It looks like they have all of this good information here. They have a GPA, and it's a high GPA. Why would that be pending? What else is waiting, or what other action needs to be taken? And in fact, you can also see the students already claimed this particular school as their college of attendance, but right there on the school change button, they can actually change that over to any other campus that they actually end up attending. And it's going to tell students how much they've been awarded and how much remaining eligibility there is. And the fact that this shows that there are 4 years left tells me that this is a freshman student who's never been to college before, because they have the maximum eligibility of 4 years. But let's look at why this is pending. Next slide, please. Aha, see, when a student clicks on the to do box, this is what popped up. Remember, I talked about how students have to claim their Cal Grant Award by self-certifying their high school graduation. This is what pops up. So it's already got the students' school of attendance listed. It shows them that their FAFSA and their GPA were submitted, and it auto-populates the high school graduation date that that particular school is set to graduate. All the student does is click the radio button, either yes, they graduated, or no, they did not. That's pretty self-explanatory, but the thing is that a lot of students don't actually pull up the portal, and so they have no idea what the status is or whether or not they were awarded. So this is their self-help link or website. Next slide, please. So just in closing, some tips on how you all can help our students, whether you work at a high school, whether you're a community advocate. Be sure to sign up for the Commission's listserv. This is the way we communicate with our school segments and with other community advocates. And when you when you click on this link, you'll see that you can opt in or out of different types of alerts and notifications, such as you want to opt in to receive information about foster youth, or perhaps something about AB 540 if you work with undocumented student population. But again, teaching students to be their own financial aid experts and their own advocates so that they can set up that portal and they are really on top of it and proactive about making sure that everything is in place so that they can maximize their financial aid. And this is the prime time also, if any of you are interested in either hosting or participating in a Cash for College workshop. These are basically virtual computer labs, and we have students come into breakout rooms with subject matter experts like yourselves, maybe educators, maybe other people from the California Student Aid Commission and other educational organizations. But we're there to actually give those students one-on-one help as they navigate through the FAFSA, the DREAM Act application, the Chafee grant. So all of these workshops are completely free. So I encourage your organization to either log into this website or navigate to this website and indicate your interest in hosting a virtual computer lab to have this done. And if you can get 50 students to attend your workshop, you can receive up to $300 in funds to offset the cost of hosting that workshop. It's a great, great feel-good type of an event as well. You know that you're helping students get on the right path, and you're helping families who may not be well versed in filling out these confusing applications. But even more importantly is that they're free. I can tell you that many, many students I've talked to have been bamboozled by organizations or individuals that will charge them a high fee, a hefty fee, to fill out an application that is completely free. So we don't want anybody to have to pay. And then finally, just reminding your kids, if they think that they were in the foster program, to not only fill out their FAFSA Dream Act application, but also to submit that Chafee grant application. And Jessica also touched on this last bullet, but students who self-indicate on that FAFSA Dream Act application that they are or were not homeless, foster youth, when those applications arrive at the college will see that information and can then point the student to on-campus resources, things like priority registration or the food pantry, foster youth liaisons. There's lots of help out there if students are just a little proactive. But we also know that this student population has the greatest need. They don't have the adult support and help. So it's on the onus of all of us to help as best we can for students who need it. Next slide. Next slide, please. Jessica, we can go ahead and turn it back over to you. Jessica is going to take us home for these last 4 minutes and go over the resources section in closing. Jessica? I think we've lost Jessica. Thank you, Nick. We are trying to advance a slide. Okay, I think Jessica might have had some tech issues. So let me reshare that screen and see if we can get Jessica back on the line. Gotta love technology, huh? I'm sure this has happened to all of us in our Zoom world, but if we can get Jessica back on, she's gonna wrap up the resources section. Let me take a look. Well, I am sorry that Jessica appears to have fallen off the line, but you do have this PDF again downloadable in the SCED app. If Jessica comes on in the next couple of minutes, I'll let her resume. Otherwise, why don't I turn the or allow you to unmute yourselves to ask any final questions that you may have. I'll go ahead and answer this one question. It says, can a student apply to Chafee grant and not the FAFSA? The student has to fill out either a FAFSA or a DREAM Act application and a Chafee grant application. But no, a Chafee grant application without a FAFSA or DREAM Act application will not result in a grant. Any other questions? And if so, why don't you go ahead and unmute yourselves, and I can or raise a hand. I think it's going to make you raise a hand so that I can then allow you to talk, and we'll let you ask your question verbally. And for anybody wondering how to raise a hand, I believe if you go to the participants panel, there should be a button that says more, and I think it allows you to raise your hand. Here's another question. Is the Chafee grant application done separately from the FAFSA or DREAM Act application? It is. Yeah, so remember Jessica talked about how to fill out the FAFSA, and that's at fafsa.ed.gov. The DREAM Act application is on the CSAC homepage, csac.ca.gov. And the Chafee grant application is also on the CSAC homepage, but they're all 3 different applications. So naturally, only one FAFSA or DREAM Act application needs to be submitted, but the Chafee grant application is, yes, a separate application. Any final questions? Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and adjourn. My apologies that we lost Jessica. Oh, one last final question. Is a student who had their foster care case out of state eligible for the Chafee grant? That's a great question. Potentially, yes. So because this is both federally and state funded, students might be able to apply for, in California, it's called the Chafee grant. In other states, it might be called something else. But in talking to students, I found that they've had the option to apply to different states' version of the Chafee grant, and that the California Chafee grant pays more than other states do. But yes, they can potentially be eligible for the Chafee grant, even if their foster care placement was out of state. And so I'm going to, I'm sorry I don't have time to answer this last question live, because there's another webinar starting in just a couple minutes on the same Zoom account. So definitely feel free to email school support at csac.ca.gov so we can get your final questions answered. Thank you, everybody, so much for your time this afternoon, for your attention, and also for your great work with our students. We know that our students are suffering right now, so we really, really value and appreciate all of your work with everybody. Thank you all. Have a great rest of the afternoon. Enjoy the rest of this California College Affordability Summit. Bye-bye.